Good morning and welcome to your 7th grade language arts lesson for the week. Last week, and actually the week before that, we had been talking about context clues. So we talked about connotative, figurative meaning, and technical meanings. We talked about 5 strategies that you can use to determine word meanings. And this week, we're actually going to be moving into a new standard about compare and contrasting text. So when you hear that, what does compare and contrast mean to you? And I've given 2 options here that I would like for you to look at. A, does compare and contrasting mean that you will find the similarities and the differences between 2 things? Or does it mean comparing and contrasting means that you describe how things happen between 2 things? I'm going to give you just a second to think about which answer you would choose. And in my class, I would ask, who is for A? Who is for B? And the answer would be A. Comparing and contrasting means that you find the similarities and the differences between 2 things. That can also mean 2 articles, 2 people. Things is kind of like a general term there. So our target that we're going to be looking at is how to analyze 2 or more authors writing about the same topic and how that shapes their presentation of key information by emphasizing different evidence or advancing different interpretations of facts. More specifically, there are 2 questions that I would like for you to ask yourself as we make our way through this unit. First question is, which details, facts, or evidence do the authors emphasize? Second question is, where and when do the author's examples and evidence or explanations and interpretations differ and agree? Now, if you're like my students, you would probably be asking, why do we need to learn this? And I'm glad that you asked that because there are some very important reasons why. First is, asking questions allows you to develop higher order thinking skills. No matter your level of student, whether you're talking about middle school or high school or even beyond, every year that you go through, you are going to have to take a standard and be asked to do something just a little bit different with it. In other words, it's going to be adding a component each year. It will allow you to focus on details and improve comprehension skills. I don't care what level of a reader you are. There's always a chance and always a way for us to improve our comprehension skills. So hopefully through this lesson, you're going to get a few tips that will help you out. It will help you to retain information as you're reading because we all know that that's important. I know that I have students that they can read an article and they can tell me 1 sentence about the article, but if I'm asking details, they kind of miss that out. And so this will help you be better at that. It will also help you to understand how to organize information, think more clearly, and express ideas more effectively. Now, speaking of organizing information, it's very important for you to know how to do that. And the first time that I ever told my students, sure, you can write in your novel that we're reading in because it was their own copy, they all had a freak out moment because, Miss Roberts, we don't write in our textbooks and on our papers and everything. And that's true, we don't write in our textbooks. Sometimes I do give my students their own copies of stories, and I highly encourage them to write on those stories, which is very important. It's all about organizing information. A side tip, if you can't write on the piece of paper, grab a sticky note or even grab another piece of paper and jot down your ideas on it. In fact, speaking of organizing information, can you tell me the best graphic organizer that we could use in order to organize the information as we read it? Did you come up with it? Because the organizer that I like to use in this would be considered the Venn diagram. And this is very important because your Venn diagram allows you to note the differences and it allows you to note the similarities. And that's the whole purpose of comparing and contrasting, is noting the similarities and the differences. Now, If you're like my students and you completely do not like drawing circles, it's totally fine. You can draw boxes, you can make columns, you can take your paper and fold it into 3 sections, whatever works for you. You just need to make sure that you have somewhere that you can note differences and that you can note similarities. So let's move on. I want you to imagine this. I'm going to show you 2 photographs. They were taken by the same photographer using the same camera of a castle in Orlando, and I'm sure that you can possibly think about which castle I might be referring to. And this is a nod to my coworkers who are apparently having withdrawals from the most magical place on earth. What would happen if you saw this picture? What are you thinking about? What does the castle look like? What if I showed you this castle? It's the same castle, it's just taken at 2 different times. The first castle is going to depict something dark and scary. Now, I'm not saying that Cinderella's castle is actually scary, but the image is what we're looking at. Then when you look at this picture, this one paints a bright and peaceful place, all right? So I've been here before. I took my nephew when he was 4 years old, and I remember we were walking down Main Street and everybody's smiling and everybody's trying to make their way to this castle. If he had seen the first castle, he might not have been so excited about it. So, keeping in mind that the photographers used the same camera and they took the picture of the same subject, they each had a different objective. They wanted to showcase something, and they used their photos to do that. Authors do the same thing when they may write about the same topic, but they're coming from different perspectives. It's very interesting because I had some students one time and they came into my room and they were all excited about what had happened at PE in the volleyball game. And it was funny listening to them because student A gave me one perspective, student B gave me another perspective, and I realized that they were actually on opposite sides. And so because of that, they gave me 2 different perspectives of who had actually won the game and who had done a better job. And so it's the same way with authors. When we have that, we have to sit there and think about what are they telling me that's different and what are they telling me that's similar. Let's look at these photos. Now these are photos of book covers, and they're about the New York City Triangle Factory Fire. Which one do you think focuses on the facts and details of the event? Which one do you think focuses on the viewpoints of people involved in the fire? And this is important because both of these books talk about the same event, but they both take different perspectives. So you have to understand that authors present information in a way that they want the reader to know about. And it's up to us as the reader to decipher or decide what they're trying to tell us. So, we are going to do some practice time. And here's what I want you to think about. I want you to see what information readers may use when writing something. So in our 2 practice sessions, one, I'm going to show you a cartoon strip, and I want you to look at it because I'm going to ask some questions. The other practice time is going to be 2 different excerpts from authors about the same topic. And I want you to see how the 2 excerpts will differ. So the first one is about global warming. I'm going to show you a cartoon strip on the next slide. And I want you to think about how the characters are reacting to the poster. And here's the 2 questions that I want you to think about. What if they both decided to write reports about global warming? How might each of them approach the topic? So keep in mind, about global warming, and it's about how each would approach the topic. So here we have 2 students, and I kind of pictured this as something that might be seen in a science hallway on their bulletin board. So you have a picture, it's a poster actually, and it says Stop Global Warming, and it's got a picture of a polar bear and its cub. It's on a piece of ice, and they're out in the middle of the water. So you have student A And she's sitting over there thinking, well, what causes global warming? Student B, on the other hand, he's thinking about what's going to happen to those poor bears. So they're looking at the same picture, but they're wondering about two totally different things. It's the same concept. If we take this information in this chart, which facts do you think that each of the two characters would emphasize when writing about global warming? Let's take the first column. It says Earth's average temperatures are increasing. Rising temperatures result in melting of the polar ice caps. The polar ice melt causes sea levels to rise. Then we have the middle one. It says fossil fuel emissions release heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere. The additional heat raises local temperatures and in turn impacts Earth's climate. The third column says loss of habitat due to ice melt results in decreasing animal populations. Changes in feeding and migration patterns put animals at risk. This is the information that the students might look at and use as a basis for their paper that they would write. So we're going to go back and I want you to look again at this because I'm going to give you the facts one more time and we're going to decide which student would use which column. Now remember, she's thinking about global warming, he's thinking about the polar bears. So here we have Earth's average temperatures are increasing. Rising temperatures result in the melting of the polar ice caps. Polar ice melt causes sea levels to rise. Which student might possibly use that one? Now keep in mind, you're asking yourself, they're getting information to write, what could they possibly use? Could both students use that column? If you said yes, you are correct. Both students could. So let's look at the middle column. It says fossil fuel emissions release heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere. The additional heat raises local temperatures and in turn impacts Earth's climate. Which topic would that relate to? Would it relate to the young lady who's thinking about what causes global warming, or would it relate to the young man? Did you say that it would be the young lady? Because you would be correct. And by process of elimination, we would know that the young man would choose the third column. But we also know that because it specifically talks about animal populations, talks about migration patterns and putting animals at risk. Now, that's one way in order to do compare and contrasting text. But what I do want you to remember is that the author's purpose, in other words, what they're wanting to accomplish, will shape the way that he or she presents key information, as well as which facts and evidence are emphasized. For example, if you asked me to write about my profession as a teacher, I could do that. I love my job. I love what I do. I love my kids. However, if you asked my brother, who's a farmer, to write something on teaching, his response is going to be totally opposite of mine, and vice versa. If I had to write a paper about farming, mine is not going to be the same as his, mainly because I don't have as much information on farming as he would, nor does he have the information about teaching. So it's all about in what the author would want you to know. So your next practice, I'm going to ask you once again to remember what is our author's purpose. In other words, what are they wanting us to know? I also want you to consider why these two excerpts about Amelia Earhart are different. Think about the author's purposes for writing, their points of view, and the information that they chose. So the first one is labeled Born to Fly by Anne Randall. Amelia Earhart didn't always dream of becoming an aviator. While she had seen airplanes growing up, it wasn't until her early 20s that she realized she was born to fly. When Earhart was 20 years old, she and a friend attended a stunt flying contest. Their fun ended, however, when one of the planes came zooming toward them. In spite of the danger, Earhart stood firm, displaying the same fearlessness that she would continue to show all her life. This encounter proved to be a sign of things to come. Just a few years later, Earhart found herself flying inside an airplane. On December 28, 1920, pilot Frank Hawks changed Earhart's life by taking her on her first plane ride. It was then that she knew she was meant to be in the air. Earhart attended her first flying lesson just 5 days later, and by 1922, she was already setting records. She became the first woman to fly to an altitude of 14,000 feet. Over the next 15 years, Earhart would continue to make her mark on the record books time and time again, proving that flying was truly in her blood. So if we look at this excerpt, what is the purpose of the author writing this? If you said to give a background of how she became an aviator, you would be correct. Now, we're going to look at a second excerpt. This one is entitled Earhart on Equality by Brian Vargas. As a famous female aviator, Amelia Earhart did much to advance equality for women. In 1928, she became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic, and she spent the rest of her life fearlessly flying farther, faster. Earhart was first to fly many long, dangerous routes, and she encouraged other women to fly. She championed women in the sciences as a guest professor at Purdue University. She said, "Women must try to do things as men have tried. When they fail, their future must be but a challenge to others." This excerpt focuses on Amelia Earhart encouraging other women, right? So it does differ from our first one. Now, earlier I told you one way to organize your information is to create a Venn diagram. So if you were to make a Venn diagram, first thing I tell my students is make sure you label each side. Labeling is extremely important because it allows you to find your information later. Now, I didn't label differences, but I did put the titles of the excerpts up there. Now, if you were doing this on your own or in class, your teacher may instruct you to go back to the excerpt and think about what information you would put in each side. So under Born to Fly, if I were doing this as a student, I might write, didn't realize she wanted to fly until she was in her 20s. Became an accomplished pilot in 2 years, started setting world records, and became the first woman to fly to an altitude of 14,000 feet. I'm going to focus on the history of Amelia Earhart because that's what the excerpt was about. On the other hand, if I look at Earhart on equality, what am I going to focus on? About her champion for women. So I might put help lead to advance equality for women, encouraged other women to start flying, and became a champion for women in sciences. And that's true. So we can look, we have here where she's encouraging women, and we have the other side where we're learning her history. But now we have to look at the similarities. She faced danger at an air show and in flying solo. That's true because Amelia Earhart was one of the first female pilots. She also focuses on her career in both articles. Now, here's what you need to understand. Sometimes when you're reading articles, the differences, you might only have one or two there. You may have more similarities. On the other hand, you may have a lot more differences with only a couple of similarities. There is no right or wrong as long as you make sure that you put all your information on your graphic organizer. And as we wrap this up for the week, what I would like for you to do as you're working through your work, remember to ask yourself these two questions. Which details, facts, or evidence do the authors emphasize? And where and when do the author's examples and evidence or explanations and interpretations differ and agree? You will be presented different either excerpts or articles. You need to remember these questions. I would also like to remind you to make sure to check your assignment by your teacher and pay attention to those due days. It's very important to keep on top of your work during this time.